When we pick up a Bible, we notice that it is a very big book. And a lot of times the fact that it's big is intimidating to people. One of the ways to look at the Bible and see how it is divided up is to look and to note that the Bible is made up of two testaments. Those two testaments, as we all know, are called the New Testament and the Old Testament. Now, that brings up a question. Why is the Old Testament an Old Testament? What makes the New Testament new? And so that's what I want us to consider in this lesson, is the idea of the Old Testament being old. But to do that, we have to understand what the Old Testament was about. And for that matter, who the Old Testament was to. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 1, in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, speaks this way about how God has spoken to people during the generations of this world. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers, in the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the world. Now, notice in that first verse, the Hebrew writer makes it clear God did used to speak through our fathers. Understanding that the book of Hebrews is written to Jewish Christians, Jews who had become Christians. So the fathers would have been people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And he goes on and also says the prophets. And so when we move farther forward in the Old Testament, we understand that later on in the Bible times, Old Testament times, you had prophets of God who came and spoke to God's people, the Israelites. And so the Hebrew writer is telling these Jewish Christians about how God used to speak in past times. But then he says now he speaks to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. That is a very good picture of the Bible. The Bible is made up of two testaments. The Old Testament covers a time period all the way from creation up until the time 400 years before Jesus Christ was born on this earth. During those 400 years, we had a silent period when God didn't speak to man. But during these years prior to that, all the way back until creation, God did speak to men in different ways. Before Moses came on the scene, God spoke normally to the heads of the households, called the patriarchs oftentimes. And for that reason, people oftentimes will call that the patriarchal age. Following Moses coming, the law of Moses was given on Mount Sinai. And at that time period, from that time period on, God spoke through the prophets. Moses was the one we understand to have written the first 5 books of the Bible. And on down until, as I said, 400 years before Jesus Christ came, there were various men who wrote various books of the Old Testament. Now, the law of Moses is one that a lot of people recognize quite easily, especially the 10 Commandments. Many people in the world, even who have very little knowledge of the Bible, know about the 10 Commandments. Who was the law given to, including the 10 Commandments? That's a question that needs to be considered when you're looking at the Bible. When you go to Exodus chapter 22, where the 10 Commandments were given on Mount Sinai, we see within those verses that God was speaking through Moses to the children of Israel after they had come out of Egypt, traveled to Mount Sinai, and at that point, the 10 Commandments and then the rest of the law was going to be given to Moses, but for the Israelites. Did you ever realize that? The Old Testament was specifically a list of ordinances given to the Israelites. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 2 and 3, we read these words: "The Lord our God has made a covenant with us at Horeb." This is Moses speaking. "The Lord our God has made a covenant with us at Horeb. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, with all of us alive here today. Now, I said that is Moses speaking, but look who Moses is speaking to. Back up to verse 1. Then Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances which I am speaking today in your hearing, that you may learn them and observe them carefully. Notice Moses, speaking to the Israelites, telling them to learn and observe these statutes, these ordinances. Then he says in verse 2, once again, the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Who's the us? Well, Moses and the rest of the Israelites. The covenant, the Old Testament, was made with the Israelites. A lot of people will sit and believe that the Old Testament is something that was written for the entire world. And within the context of the Bible, we find out it was to the Israelites that it was written. So the Israelites were the ones who were given the old law. They were the ones who were required to follow the old law. When we come to the New Testament, we come to find out that the fact that the Israelites were given the old law not only made them God's chosen people, it also excluded the Gentiles. Look at what we read in Ephesians chapter 2, starting with verse 11. Therefore, remember that formerly you Gentiles in the flesh who are called the uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace. Now notice what happened. When the law of commandments were taken away, the Gentiles were able to be combined with the Jews into becoming one man through Jesus Christ. In fact, look at how it's described. It's described in enmity, the law of commandments. That word enmity, very close to the word enemy. It was actually something that was keeping God's plan for all nations to be brought into his fold from being able to occur until the old covenant was taken away. That could not occur because the old covenant made the Jews God's chosen people. Under the new covenant, God's chosen people are all those who are willing to come into under this covenant. So, Paul speaks about the same thing in the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 3, he mentions the seed promise that came through Abraham. Remember when Abraham was told to sacrifice his son Isaac? He went to the mountain to sacrifice him, and God stopped him. And then he told him because he had been willing to sacrifice his son, that in Genesis 22, God says, through your seed shall all nations be blessed. Well, Paul speaks about that in Galatians chapter 3. And Paul makes it clear that the seed was Jesus Christ. And Paul goes on to say in verse 23 through 28, listen to these words. But before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up in the faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a tutor. For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free man. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Notice what happened. When the old law, the old covenant, the Old Testament was fulfilled, when Jesus Christ had come, sometime during that time period, that tutor, that guardian, that slave that was protecting God's chosen people, was taken away. And because of that, now there is no more Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free man. Well, there still were people who were slaves and still were people who were free. There really still were and still are people who are male and female. And there really still are people who are physically Jew and not Jew, being Gentile. But those things didn't matter anymore, because the old law is what made the idea of there even being a Jew or a Gentile, a chosen people and people who are not God's chosen people. Under the new covenant, now all are able to be God's chosen people. All are able to come under this new covenant. And the whole purpose of the old covenant was to bring us to Christ. Paul also speaks about that idea in Colossians chapter 2. Listen to these words. Having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees that were against us, which was hostile to us, and he was taken out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Now, how do we know he's talking about the old law there? Well, keep on reading. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. Now, we understand the Jewish requirements as far as what they were allowed to eat. We also understand about the Sabbath day, which is in the Ten Commandments. But if you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verse 3, you come to find a verse that shows us that that idea of a festival, a new moon, or a Sabbath day belonged to the law of Moses. So what was nailed to that cross? Because up until during the time of the Old Covenant, you certainly could judge people and were supposed to judge people. People could be punished for breaking the Sabbath day law. But now, under the new covenant, you cannot be judged by that. That old covenant was nailed to the cross. So we see the old covenant had a purpose to bring us to Christ. The old covenant had a shelf life. The time period till Christ came, specifically according to Paul, when Christ died on the cross, the old covenant was fulfilled. The old covenant had served its purpose, and it was taken away. So now when we look at our Bible and we realize how big it is, we can now realize a Bible that is that fat is now, as far as what we're required to follow, to keep, is only this much, the New Testament.